is to talk about the tissue types that compose the epidermis and dermis, and then describe some of their functions. So keeping in the theme of what we were just talking about, right, those membranes. We said a membrane is the epithelia and the underlying connective tissue. The skin is an example of a membrane, right? It's comprised of an epidermis, which is the epithelial layer, and then an underlying connective tissue, which is the dermis, okay? So the two distinct layers of the skin are the epidermis and the dermis. The hypodermis is another layer which is deep to the dermis, and it's not, strictly speaking, a part of the skin, right? The skin is really just the epidermis and the dermis. Now, the skin is the largest organ in the body. It's everything you see when you first look at someone. It's 7% of your body weight, so a significant chunk of your body weight is just skin. And then it varies in thickness from 1.5 millimeters in areas like your face and the inside of your elbows to thicker areas where it's about 4.4 millimeters, like your palms and soles and the skin on the back, okay? If we look at the hypodermis, which is deeper to the dermis, it's mostly made up of fat and a small amount of alveolar connective tissue, which is a loose type of connective tissue. Okay, and as I mentioned earlier, it's not a part of the skin, strictly speaking. It's just a supportive layer, mostly fat, which is underneath the skin. Now, there are some important functions of the skin. I'll go through these. The first one is protection. So the skin is the first layer of defense. It protects against external abrasion. It helps to cushion the internal organs from bumps, from chemicals, from heat loss, from water loss, from any type of external radiation. So it's our first line of defense. So essentially, it's a part of the immune system in this way. The skin also functions in regulating body temperature. So there are some capillary networks that are involved in the dermis of the skin, that help to shunt blood either away from or towards the skin as a part of regulating heat loss. So an example here is if you're in an extremely warm area, if you're hot, the body or the skin will shunt blood towards those capillaries, towards the skin. And in this way, you can lose some of that heat as blood gets to the superficial areas of the skin. All right, alternatively, if you're in a cold environment and you're trying to preserve heat, the skin will shunt blood away from these capillaries and keep it closer to your core organs, your heart, your lungs, and help to preserve the loss of that heat by preventing that blood from going into those capillary networks, which are in the skin. So in such a way, the body temperature can be regulated through the capillary networks that are in the skin, as well as the sweat glands, right? Similar phenomenon with the sweat glands. If you're really hot, you can lose heat through the sweat. If you're cold, you won't be sweating, and so you'll preserve some of that heat. Another function of the skin is excretion. So we lose some urea, which is a waste product of the body. We lose some salt, so salts can be regulated, and obviously water through the sweat, and that is an excretory function. And then the production of vitamin D happens through the epidermal cells. So this is why you go out in the sun to get a lot of vitamin D. That is absorbed directly through the skin and can be converted into an active form of vitamin D. And then lastly, the sensory reception associated with the skin is an important part of human function, right? Being able to touch things with the skin, being able to detect hot and cold, and so on and so forth. So these are some important functions of the skin, and we'll talk about some of the structures which bring about those functions as we move on. Now, this image here pretty much summarizes the layers of the skin that we'll talk about. The epidermis, which is this topmost layer. And again, this is an avascular layer, but it is innervated, okay? And it's only made up of cells, pretty much cell next to cell next to cell, because this is the epithelial layer. This is made of stratified squamous epithelium typically, okay? Deeper to the epidermis is the more functional layer of the skin, the dermis. It's the thicker layer. It's divided into two. There's a papillary layer and there's a reticular layer, which is the larger chunk of the dermis. Here you find sweat glands, you find your apocrine sweat glands, you find sebaceous glands, the hair roots, right? The hair follicles as well. You have the nervous structures here, so sensory nerve fibers, and so on and so forth. So pretty much all of the function of the skin, the structures related to that are in the dermis, the deeper part of the skin. All right, let's move on to objective 3, which is speaking about each of the layers of the epidermis and dermis and then talking about their function. Okay, now there are 4 cell types that we're going to encounter as we move through each of these layers. We'll talk about the 4 cell types first, and then as we go through each layer, I'll point out the location of each of these cell types. So the 4 cells of the skin are going to be keratinocytes. These are mainly focused throughout the stratum spinosum, and their main job is to produce keratin, which is a thick, fibrous protein that really gives skin its strength and its resistance to abrasion, right? The keratinocytes are the most numerous cell that's seen in the skin, and they look very differently in the bottom layer than they do at the top. So they go through a really important transition as they migrate to the top layer that we'll talk about. Then there are the melanocytes. These are in the basal layer only, the melanocytes. Their job is to secrete pigment. And melanocytes actually secrete pigment in response to sun exposure. So we'll talk about that a little bit more when we talk about melanin, but the pigment that's produced by melanocytes is an important response to sun exposure. Then there are tactile epithelial cells, which are located in the dermis, in the epidermis, the stratum basal, and then they project their sensory nerve ending down into the dermis. So I'll say that again. The tactile epithelial cells are located in the stratum basal of the epidermis, and then the nerve endings, or the axon, is going to stretch right down into the dermis, which is the underlying connective tissue layer. And then finally, dendritic cells are in the stratum spinosum, and these cells play a part of the immune system. They're gonna engulf any bacteria, engulf any viruses, clean up any debris, any dead cells. They play a similar role to the microglial cells that we saw in the brain. They're really working as a part of the immune system, right? Engulfing bacteria and any other pathogens. So those are the 4 cells of the epidermis, and we'll talk about them as we go through each layer. Let's keep going. So we're going to speak about the skin from the deepest layer, the layer that's right on top of the dermis, to the most superficial layer. So from the deepest layer will be stratum basal, and then the most superficial layer is stratum corneum. There are a lot of different mnemonics to help you remember this. One that I like is "Come, let's get sunburnt," which is from the superficial layer all the way down to the deepest layer. So let's start by looking at stratum basal. Stratum basal is the deepest layer of the epidermis. So it's sitting right on top of the dermis. It helps to anchor the epidermis to the underlying dermis. Right? So it's a very important layer in terms of the integrity of the skin. It has cells that are actively dividing. We call these stem cells. And their job is basically to divide and produce new cells that migrate to the topmost layer. Keep in mind that as we speak about these layers, this is still an epithelial layer. So it's made mostly of cells, and these cells are simple squamous cells that have been stacked on top of each other, forming a stratified squamous epithelium, okay? Stratified squamous epithelium. The 2 cells that are found in stratum basal are your tactile epithelial cells, which are your sensory perceptive cells that have those nerve endings that I mentioned, as well as your melanocytes that are secreting the pigment melanin. So in the deepest layer of the skin, the most important thing down here is the stem cells that are actively dividing to create new cells. because this layer is so close to the dermis, it's really close to the blood supply from the vessels in the dermis. And so these cells have the nutrients and the energy that they need to continually divide and produce more cells. Stratum spinosum is the second layer up, so it's the second layer from the bottom, and it's the thickest layer of the skin, and it's sometimes called a spiny layer because of the way it appears during histological studies. It usually has thick bundles of filaments, which we call tonofilaments, and these filaments are made of a protein called prekeratin. So prekeratin is essentially the precursor of keratin, and it helps to resist tension or tearing or any type of injury to the skin. So the roughness or the thickness, the resistance of the skin to tension is brought about by these tonofilaments in the stratum spinosum. All right, now among the stratum spinosum, we also have dendritic cells. So we talked about dendritic cells earlier, and just to point out, this is the layer that they're found in the stratum spinosum. Okay. Now they're a type of macrophage, and we already mentioned they're part of the immune system. So the two take-home points for the stratum spinosum are that it's the thickest layer. It contains tonofilaments, which are made of prekeratin. This gives skin its strength, as well as the dendritic cells, which are part of the immune system. Okay. Now, from this layer upwards, so from stratum granulosum up to stratum corneum, the cells here are dead. So the cells die at this point. Okay, so this is a very small layer, mostly keratinocytes. But as you can see in this image, one, they are much flatter. They start to lose their nucleus, and they have this granular appearance. So there's this granulated appearance to this layer. This is why it's called granulosum. And that granular appearance is caused by two types of granules: keratohyalin granules, which are granules that help to make keratin from that prekeratin. And then lamellar granules are basically made of glycolipids, and this gives skin its waterproof ability. So this is why you don't absorb water through the skin. The presence of these lamellar granules in the stratum granulosum that are containing glycolipids and help to make skin waterproof. Okay, so the 3 important points of the stratum granulosum is it's a smaller layer, it's granular because of these two types of granules, and from this point onwards, the cells are dead. They're dead, they start to flatten out, they lose their nucleus. Okay. Stratum lucidum. This is a layer worth making note of. This layer is only found in areas where the skin is extremely thick, such as the palm of the hands and the soles of the feet. So areas like your face, on your skin on your face, the skin on your chest, does not have a stratum lucidum. Right? Stratum lucidum is a clear layer, and it's composed mainly of a few rows of flat, dead keratinocytes. So as I mentioned before, from this layer and this top layer, the cells here are dead. They don't have a nucleus, they're flat, their plasma membrane has begun to thicken up so that they really don't have much cytoplasm. It's just the thick plasma layer and then the flattened cell, which is really giving some roughness and some thickness to the skin in this layer. And then the final layer is stratum corneum. This is the topmost layer. This is what you see when you look at someone. This is nothing but a thick layer of flat, dead keratinocytes. All right, so this is a much thicker layer than stratum lucidum. And it's made only of flat, dead cells. The plasma membrane of these cells has thickened significantly, such that there's no cytoplasm, there are no organelles in the cell, there's no nucleus. And the main function of this thick layer of dead cells is to be that final protective layer against abrasion, against penetration, against chemicals, and all types of external environments. So basically, the cells in this layer are dead, thick, and